Hello, my name is Jorge Gaviria, and I'm the founder of Macienda. We partner with farmers in Mexico to bring heirloom corn products to every kitchen. With my Spark Cash Plus card from Capital One, I earn unlimited 2% cash back on every purchase. And it has no preset spending limit, which means my purchasing power adapts to my business needs. My Spark card helps me fulfill my mission of bringing masa to the masses. Capital One, what's in your wallet?
Terms and conditions apply. Find out more at CapitalOne.com/SparkCashPlus.
Welcome back, my friends. Laszlo Montgomery here. My deepest appreciation for listening to the China History Podcast. Plenty of Chinese philosophy to go still. Without further ado, let's begin our examination of the world of Neo Confucianism during the Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279. Whereas in the classical period of Confucianism, before the Qin, the emphasis was on ethics, social order, and the organization of the state, Song-era Neo-Confucians focused their energy instead on the mind and on the nature of human beings and of things. They didn't necessarily incorporate Buddhist or Taoist thought into their Confucian ideology, but they did acquire a great deal of cosmological and metaphysical inspiration from Buddhist and Taoist doctrine. These Song-era Confucians will really push the envelope as far as the directions they took their philosophy. Song Dynasty philosophers were not without their challenges. Trying to dust off and reshape an ideology that came from almost 15 centuries before was their mission impossible. There were two concepts that existed and were well developed in the Song that no one had a clue about during the Eastern Zhou. This was the understanding of qi and li. I mentioned that in the Han, they were pretty sure about the nature of qi, being the underlying stuff out of which everything condenses. But the importance and role of qi becomes much better understood in the Song, especially when we get to Zhang Zai. Let's look at the so-called 5 founding fathers of Neo-Confucianist thought. They all shared in this belief that a society based on the Tao could only be achieved through self-cultivation of one's xin, or mind-heart, it's also called, to bring harmony to heaven, earth, humanity, Tian Di Ren, once again. Let's first look at the figure most of the history books start with, and this is Zhou Dunyi. Now, what's his soundbite? China's first cosmological philosopher. He lived from 1017 to 1073. All 5 of these northern Song founders of Neo-Confucianism, they all lived more or less around the same time, and they knew each other. In fact, 2 of them, I think I mentioned, were brothers, Cheng Yi and Cheng Hao. But Zhou Dunyi, he was most interesting. Well, to me at least. If everything is leading up to the great Neo-Confucianist philosopher Zhu Xi, you can say the road starts here, with Zhou Dunyi. He wasn't terribly well known in his day. He left behind a body of work that was quite influential, and his 2 prize students were the Cheng brothers, Cheng Hao and Cheng Yi. These 2 will take these teachings of Zhou Dunyi and later pass them on to Zhu Xi himself. Zhou Dunyi knew his I Ching inside out. Inspired by his 11th century understanding of the I Ching and both philosophical and religious Taoism, Zhou Dunyi reinterpreted all these esoteric Taoist diagrams, and he reinterpreted these diagrams and came up with his own idea about cosmic evolution. I guess perhaps the most important thing that Zhou Dunyi is remembered for is his explanation of the Taiji Tushuo, the diagram to the Supreme Ultimate. He came up with the concept of the Taiji, the Supreme Ultimate. This is represented by the iconic yin-yang symbol we've all seen and maybe have tattooed on our body. Zhou Dunyi is the one we thank for that image. Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, they never saw it. This Taoist diagram was called the Taiji Tu, the diagram of the Supreme Ultimate. I myself find it very hard to explain, but it was extremely influential in Zhu Xi's later outline for his cosmology. In this work, he explains by using this diagram the process through which qi takes form in things. There are 2 main parts. An essay where Zhou Dunyi explains his version of the evolution of the cosmos, The other part of the book explains the Taiji Tu, this diagram of the Supreme Ultimate. The Taiji Tu diagram, as profound and sacred as the later Neo Confucianists considered it, appears on the surface as rather simplistic and ordinary. Let me quote a section that attempts to explain Zhou Dunyi's cosmological thoughts. Quote, "In the beginning, there was Taiji, the Supreme Ultimate, that was fundamentally identical with Wuji, the ultimate of non-being. Because of the abundance of energy within Taiji, it began to move and thus produce the Yang. When the activity of the Yang reached its limit, it reverted to tranquility. Through tranquility, the Yin was generated. When tranquility reached its limit, it returned to Yang. Thus, Yin and Yang generated each other. Then, through the union of the Yin and the Yang, the transformation of the Wuxing, the 5 elements of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, were brought into being. And these 5 elements represent material principles rather than actual things. The 5 elements can therefore be considered the common basis of all things. The interaction of the Yin and the Yang through different combinations of the 5 elements generates all things in a process of endless transformation." End quote. We've seen how, as Chinese civilization advanced forward along the history timeline, every so often philosophers and scholars of the day had to take stock of the knowledge they had and reconcile it with all the current advances in intellectual thought. In the Han Dynasty, they looked back on those philosophers from the warring states and proclaimed, those guys knew nothing compared to them in their modern times. And then in the Tang, they did the same thing again, looking back half a millennia on all those Han-era luminaries, and they too thought, what did they know compared to us in our day? Well, from Zhou to Han isn't that huge of a stretch, but Zhou to Tang was a truly great leap of 700 years. Now, in the Song Dynasty, the 11th century, they look back at the genesis of Confucianism from an astronomically different perch than the pre-Qin era Confucianists of the 5th to 3rd centuries BCE. I often hear chatter in the USA about the Founding Fathers, drafting the Constitution, Bill of Rights, all the laws. I don't know how many times I heard people say, if they only knew what we knew about in our time, they would have done things differently. Or ask, were the founders supposed to know that this or that would come along and change everything? Well, it's the same in the Song Dynasty. Yeah, that period was from 1,000 years ago, but still, in their day, they were able to look back on Confucianism and say, man, those guys didn't know what we know today about the forces of Yin and Yang, Qi, the 5 elements, the I Ching, and all the new ideas and influences of Taoism and Buddhism. It was like a different universe in the Song compared to the days when Mengzi was trying to convince Qi Xuangong, Duke Xuan of Qi, to make peace and not war. There was some serious readjusting that needed to be done. So for the remainder of this History of Chinese Philosophy series, we will look at what Han Yu and Li Ao started with the Tang revival of Confucianism, and then what the so-called 5 founders of Neo-Confucianism advanced. Then from that point, we will at last examine all the things Zhu Xi did after he came along in the 12th century. And to alleviate your fears that this series may be unending, we'll conclude things with the finishing touches that Wang Shouren, a.k.a. Wang Yangming, what he does to further advance and improve Confucian thought. So let's start off with Zhou Dunyi. Zhu Xi is going to heap a lot of praise on him, calling him the first sage of the Song Dynasty. In addition to Zhou Dunyi's explanation of the Taiji Tu, called the Taiji Tu Shuo, his other work that helped with the foundation of Neo-Confucianism was titled Penetrating the Classic of Change. The Classic of Change, of course, the I Ching. This other work by Zhou Dunyi, known as the Tongshu. This work concerns itself with the morality of the sage being the model for all humanity. This model sage embodies authenticity, Cheng, This Cheng, this sincerity, authenticity, is central to achieving one's ultimate moral potential. Sageliness is what Confucianism is all about. And the humanistic ethics central to Confucianism, wisdom, righteousness, humanity, propriety, sincerity, were at the center of what Zhou Dunyi taught. That's what made him Confucian. He spoke of the 5 constant virtues, the Wu Chang, Ren, Yi, Li, Zhi, and Xin, benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom, and fidelity. And into all this Confucian thought, Zhou Dunyi injected his cosmology and ideas concerning yin and yang, mixing cosmology with humanity. But it's the Taiji Tu Shuo that Zhou Dunyi is perhaps best known. He was the first one to use the iconic yin-yang symbol and explain it and link both this symbol and ethical concepts from the I Ching, the Book of Changes, and tie it all up in a neat little bow with Confucianism. And at the same time, Zhou offered up a cosmology that explained the source of all reality, how yin and yang came to be, and how they interact with the 5 elements, which drive the cycles of seasons, not to mention everything else in the world. Zhou Dunyi figured all that out, and didn't even have the internet. So Zhou Dunyi was a giant of his day, an original thinker, who took what was out there and rearranged it in a very intelligent way. And his 2 prize students, who picked up where he left off, were the Cheng brothers. But before we get to the Chengs, let's take a quick look at Shao Yong and Zhang Zai, 2 of the other founders of Song Neo Confucianism, and then we'll look at the Cheng brothers. Shao Yong, the numbers man. I won't say too much about him except that he was a math genius of the highest order. He saw that the underlying principles of human existence were revealed by numbers. Shao Yong's focus was primarily on cosmology, and his main tool to unravel the mystery was the I Ching. What Shao Yong did was to peruse the I Ching and sort out the entire 12-month cycle, the seasons, solstices, waxing, waning, and from this angle, he tried to figure things out and gain insight into what lie ahead. Shao Yong's major work was the Book of Supreme Ordering Principles, the Huangji Jing Shi. In this work, Shao Yong developed these diagrams. Yeah, they love their diagrams in the Song dynasty, based on the 64 hexagrams. And in Shao Yong's diagrams, it explained how the whole cycle worked, all the laws that govern the transformation of individual things. And like I said, he drew from the I Ching to show how it all worked. And if you're like me and never got better than a C in math, it's hard to comprehend. This was the kind of stuff that was going on during the Song dynasty. By now, we're far enough along for you to see how this whole philosophy progressed and how fancy and complicated it got compared to what was being bandied about during the classical period. Let's look at Zhang Zai now. Like all 5 of these founders, he was another big fan of the I Ching. Just because someone was a Confucian didn't mean they refused to study Taoism and Buddhism. Not everyone was like Han Yu. Like all of these Song philosophers, Zhang Zai knew his Buddhism and Taoism. But in his search for the way, the Tao, he decided Buddhism and Taoism couldn't help him much. He put all his chips on the Confucian texts. As far as Zhang Zai's cosmology and tying it in with the goals of achieving sageliness within, to become a sage, he tried to define the natural process underlying a person's everyday material existence. For this, he particularly focused on the 10 wings of the I Ching, Confucius's 10 commentaries, the Shi Yi, and Zhang Zai's main thing was the matter of qi. It's with Zhang Zai that ideas concerning qi took center stage and took on a life of their own. The Neo-Confucians placed the whole concept of qi high on their cosmology. Zhang Zai defined qi as the physical matter that makes up all existing things. In the I Ching, it says it was the supreme ultimate, the Taiji, that produced yin and yang, Well, according to Zhang Zai, the supreme ultimate was qi. Zhang's most significant contributions to Chinese philosophy were in the theories behind what is qi and what does it do. According to Zhang Zai, all things of the world are composed of this substance called qi. Substance is the word I usually see. It's like the word for dough, not so easy to precisely pin down in English. Qi is also called matter, material force, or life force. And even that, everyone hears those words and imagines their own idea. Zhang Zai said that qi included both matter as well as the forces that control the interaction between matter, that is, yin and yang. I already mentioned how qi condenses to form different things, including us. The opposite of the condensed state of qi is the dispersed state of qi. Think of it as water and evaporated water. In its dispersed state, you can't see qi. It becomes invisible, but it's there. We also call the condensed state of qi the yin force, and the dispersed state was the yang force. But as soon as the qi condenses, it becomes solid again. It becomes something. You can see it, you can touch it, and like solids, liquids, and gases, each time the qi condenses or disperses, it attains new properties. Zhang Zai said that all material things that exist are composed of qi in its condensed state. And like a proton, all qi at its most fundamental level is the same. We're all connected in this way. Not only all people, but all people with all things. And because we all contain the same essence, the Song philosopher said we can't ignore that this leads to ethical considerations. Zhang Zai didn't leave much behind. A lot of fragments of writings, but it was more than enough to work with. And as I said, when we get to Zhu Xi, he pieces together all the main ideas it contained. This notion that we are all one with all things was one of Zhang Zai's major ideas. He wrote about this in his work for which he is best known, an essay called The Western Inscription, the Xi Ming. This essay came from a work completed by Zhang in 1076 called Zhengmeng, Correcting Ignorance. In this work, Zhang Zai said, quote, "Since all things in the universe are constituted of the same qi, therefore humans and all other things are but part of one great body. We should serve heaven and earth as we do our own parents, and regard all men as we do our brothers. We should extend the virtue of filial piety and practice it through service to the universal parents." End quote. This idea was embraced by Neo Confucianists for the Confucian flavor it had. It said we were all one with a moral universe. After Zhang Zai's death, most of his disciples were absorbed into the Cheng brothers' school. What Mengzi was to Confucius, that's what the Cheng brothers were to Zhang Zai, and later on to Zhu Xi. And then 4 decades after Zhu Xi passed, Zhang Zai will get himself enshrined in the main Confucian temple. Gee, I keep mentioning Zhu Xi, and a lot of you are wondering, who? You keep saying his name, and he sounds important, but where does he fit in? Well, the Cheng brothers and Zhu Xi, that's all for next time. And until we meet again, this is Laszlo Montgomery guaranteeing you that we will take a look at the Cheng brothers, Cheng Hao and Cheng Yi, and their collective contributions to Neo-Confucianist philosophy. Take care, everyone, and come back again for what's sure to be another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.